Hi, and let's get started on our very last lecture in this class on family policy. Joan Williams is a lawyer who has written extensively about work-family issues, and she's also featured in the Motherhood Manifesto film that we're going to watch. In this reading, Marianne Mason reviews the existing policies related to stepfamilies and then makes some suggestions, and we're going to go into those in this lecture too. In the immigration kaleidoscope, Alderondo and Amin get at some of the myths about immigrant families. And so know those kind of and what the evidence is to refute them. And then is it better if immigrants assimilate right away, refuse to assimilate, or do a combination? And so you can test yourself on this here. And the answer to this iClicker question is C, to acculturate, to adopt some cultural elements from the U.S. while maintaining elements from the country of origin. This is also just worth noting from the Alderondo and Amin reading. Who, among parents and kids, who do you think assimilates to U.S. culture faster among immigrant families? And as you can imagine, that answer is, so the answer to this iClicker is that D, children assimilate faster than parents, and this can lead to dissonant acculturation patterns, basically where kids are assimilating faster than parents, and that can create some conflict. How I've structured this PowerPoint is first we're just going to talk about what social or family policy is. Then we're going to just talk about what some example policies would be related to some of the topics we've covered in the second half of this class. And then we'll talk about selected family policy issues: immigration, working families, step parents, and paternal or father involvement. So let's first just talk about what social or family policy is. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. There probably are people who would make a distinction, but for our purposes, we'll talk about them as if they're the same. I'm not sure how much you've built a paradigm around family or social policy, but it actually took me a long time to even figure out what it was about until I was taking a graduate class on it. And so basically, social or family policies are just one type of policies that we have in our United States government. You know, it's in contrast to, say, foreign policy or economic policy. And these basically are laws related to social issues and human behavior. They can be at the federal level, the national level. They can be at the state level, of course, the local level even. They can be court rulings, like from the Supreme Court or other federal courts or state courts. They can not be laws, but they can be workplace rules and regulations, or the policies associated with schools or religious institutions, or other public or private entities. They are often covering areas around income support, especially for lower income families, or medical paid, unpaid or paid medical leave. They can be related to education policies, healthcare, employment, housing, and other social services. If you're, for example, an HDFS major or a psychology major, you're generally training to intervene at the micro level, essentially, like in people's individual lives, their families, their relationships. Yet many of you are going to find that the people you work with are highly influenced by macro level policies. So maybe you're working with adolescents and in the legal system, or adoptive parents, or older adults receiving Medicare, or working parents who are having to navigate parental leave or sick leave, or immigrant families who are having to navigate a variety of policies. And so you might find yourself, basically you can only help them to a certain extent, and then you begin bumping up against whatever the rules and policies are. And so you might be needing to educate yourself and educate the families you're helping about the relevant policies. And you might find yourself in a position of having relevant knowledge to talk to policymakers or lawmakers to try to influence policies and laws. And so we're going to revisit this, but as, for example, experts in HDFS, what do you want policymakers to know when they're making these big rules and laws that are going to affect individual and family development? So, how is US policy different? Why don't we have as progressive national social policies as compared to our European counterparts? There's, probably a number of reasons for this, but a big one is that the United States gives more power to regions or states as compared to other countries. So we do have federal policies, but we give a lot of power to states. States basically can create local governments. They can regulate the business or the commerce like within the state. So, for example, like the legalization of recreational cannabis. They can come up with the laws around public schools, for rules and laws around public health and safety, and different rules, for example, about marriage and divorce. And so you may have noticed in this class several times we've talked about how laws can vary by state, that things dramatically changed in terms of the historical context of families when we passed child labor laws by state. The no-fault divorce laws by state, changed things over time, over a period of years. There's varying laws around what intimate partner violence is by state. And we can imagine that we sometimes have conflict between federal and state law. So a couple of current conflicts we have on the topic of cannabis, which is illegal under federal law, the sale, possession, and use of it. And so definitely with interstate, across state commerce, it's illegal, but states are basically saying, no, we have control over what's happening within our state, intrastate commerce and public safety. Immigration is another one. The Constitution gives the federal government to make rules about who can be a citizen, and yet some states are still trying to do their own things to restrict immigration or enforce their borders, and other state or local governments are not enforcing federal immigration laws. There's a famous saying in the field of family policy by Thomas Sowell, who is an American economist, who basically said, regarding policy, there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. And so a theme as we talk through these topics is for you to be thinking, like with each policy, what are the gains? What are the sacrifices? What are the consequences we wanted to see? And what are perhaps the unintended consequences? Before we keep going, pause and think about the topics that we've covered in this class and what an example family or social policy issue would be for one of these issues. And this could be at the federal, state, workplace level. And as you identify a policy, be thinking kind of what are the gains, the sacrifices, the intended consequences, and the unintended consequences. Okay, so I'm going to go through some policies related to the class content that we've covered. You don't need to know this for the exam. It's just to kind of give you a sense of, if you're trying to wrap your mind around what policy is. So what is it and how it tends to affect all of the domains that we have studied. So just reminding you that when we talked about race and ethnicity earlier in the semester, we talked about policies related to race in terms of the lack of legal rights of slaves, redlining in real estate, Jim Crow laws, the black codes, or the mandatory labor laws, and how all of those, even though they're no longer legal, have long-term effects. We've also talked about higher rates of incarceration for black individuals, particularly black men. And this is due to the laws typically called kind of war on drug legislation, creating stiffer penalties for drug convictions. Related to this is the 1996 PRWORA law, which reformed our welfare or TANF and food stamps or SNAP systems and created a lifetime ban if you have been a felony drug convictor. You're not allowed. If you have had a felony drug conviction, you're not allowed to receive SNAP or TANF. And once this went into place, it was correlated actually with not deterring people. It's like a stiffer penalty, but it actually wasn't a deterrent. In fact, it led to more rearrests because people couldn't afford it when they got out of prison. And so this disproportionately affects people of color and becomes a racial issue. States can remove or modify this ban, and as of 2023, about 50 states have removed the ban on both. And then some states have modified, like for example, saying you can have food stamps or TANF if you get regular drug testing. As of 2023, South Carolina was the only state that hadn't modified or removed the ban. This was a Supreme Court ruling in 2020 related to sexual orientation and gender, which basically said the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited job discrimination based on sex, also covers sexual orientation and transgender status. Sometimes our policies or laws don't just regulate what people can and can't do, but instead they allocate money to states for programs or initiatives. And so when we think of the area of relationship formation and cohabitation, we've had since 2005 the Healthy Marriage and Responsible Fatherhood grants, which are still ongoing, and they provide basically money, $150 million per year, to states to support research and programs that promote marriage and father involvement. So perhaps the biggest policy change in recent years affecting marriage was the legalization of same-sex marriage by the Supreme Court in 2015. And it also, when we look at the graph here, it also gives us a sense of how policy changes public opinion. So certainly same-sex marriage was gaining favor and decreasing in opposition, but we can see that it got even a little bit more dramatic following the legalization. When we look at the policies around shared custody in divorced families, we find, for example, state courts have varying kind of policies around shared custody. So Colorado has a long history of joint custody, even when many states were defaulting to sole custody, primarily for mothers. And so this is an example of how court rulings or judge decisions can become kind of a state policy. And then regarding federal tax law, the IRS only allows one parent actually to take the dependent deduction. And so if you have a two-parent joint kind of custody model, then not both parents can take the deduction. And so you have to decide, basically someone is given more primary custody, they can take the deduction unless they relinquish it to the other parent. It might be interesting to know that although most states have decriminalized adultery and repealed their adultery laws altogether, having an affair is still a crime, either a misdemeanor or a felony in a handful or maybe a dozen kind of U.S. states. It's not always enforced, but it's still on the books. And interestingly, adultery is considered still a severe crime for military members. In the most severe instances, you can forfeit pay and experience dishonorable discharge and confinement for a year in a facility. Less severe penalties would be disciplinary action, a rank reduction, and partial forfeiture of pay. So we learned about laws in the intimate partner violence lecture, kind of, for example, explaining how domestic violence is considered legally in Colorado, as an enhancer rather than a separate crime. Colorado is also a mandatory arrest state. And so what that means is that if police have probable cause when responding to a call about domestic violence, they must make an arrest. There's 5 indicators that could determine probable cause in Colorado: intimidation, coercion, control, punishment, and revenge. And so if police have evidence of any one of these, then they must make an arrest. The goal of this law was to prevent on-site recanting by the victim, like, oh no, there wasn't domestic violence, or pressure by the perpetrator on the victim to recant. But what has happened, if we think about kind of gains and sacrifices and unintended consequences, is that it's perhaps resulted in more arrests, maybe when the grounds are more questionable for both men and women. Okay, so as you know, we've passed laws in Colorado legalizing cannabis and psilocybin. And as you might imagine, there's kind of gains and sacrifices, or intended consequences and unintended consequences. And you can likely think of or know ones that I'm not mentioning. But for example, a gain is that we're not arresting people for minor things. Another gain is the taxes that we have on cannabis dispensaries that help fund a lot of state programs, I think particularly education. The unintended consequences are that we've have higher use. And as we've talked about in the substance use issues lecture, with the higher THC link to the risk of psychosis, we are seeing higher rates of psychosis. So for example, we've had an increase in emergency department psychosis related visits from 2013 to 2018, and those increased by 24%. Okay, let's talk about immigration policy, which I know is highly relevant to many HDFS students' lives. I do have to say, every time I lecture on this topic, I have to look things up. It's so complicated, it changes so fast, and so I'm still never confident that I've got it all correct, and I've tried to keep my scope fairly narrow because it is changing so rapidly, and it is so controversial, of course. So feel free to correct me or let me know if there's other things I should be including. Okay, so immigrants, whether with documentation or without, make up about 14% of the total population. When we look at the workforce, they make up 18%, 13% are what's called lawful, and 5% are undocumented. Immigrants are here for a variety of reasons: economics, because they've got family members here, because they're seeking refuge, and they can be here, more permanently or long term, or they might be more circular, kind of returning back home. That used to be more common for undocumented immigrants to go, come for some of the year, earn some money, bring it back home. But as we've tightened our borders, that's become more challenging. So this may be more for lawful immigrants who kind of are coming and going. In terms of education, there's, as you can see from the graph, varying education status, but overall, about 36% of US-born citizens have a bachelor's degree or higher. And that's very comparable to overall the number of foreign-born individuals in the United States over 25 who have a bachelor's degree. We can see that from the graph, that's about 10% of immigrants from Mexico and Central America who have bachelor's degree, but about 72% of immigrants, and that's primarily from India, the South Asia number there, and then also high rates from Asian countries that are disproportionately higher than the average Americans who have bachelor's degrees. And then it's important to note, and this came up in the Alderondo and Amin reading, is one of the myths that immigrants, whether lawful or undocumented, have lower crime rates than U.S. citizens. Here's a little bit more on unauthorized or undocumented immigrants. So of the immigrant population or foreign-born population, they constitute about 23% or 11 million individuals as of 2022. Of Americans saying there should be a way for immigrants to stay in the country legally, the majority of Americans do say this, according to Pew Research. There's higher rates, as we can see there, for people of color, younger people, and Democrats, lower rates for white Americans, older adults, and Republicans. Okay, I created this Pathway to Citizenship slide just to give us a sense of actually how challenging it is to become a U.S. citizen. So you don't need to know it for the exam, and you might know other things that you want to share with me. So I've kind of learned this just through having graduate students, for example, in the HDFS department who are foreign born and would like to become citizens, and how challenging it is and what a long multi-year process that is. And so it makes me realize that even for people who have a lot of education, it's really tough. And so what about all the people who don't have education, or for English is maybe their second language, for example, that it's particularly challenging. So first, in order to be a citizen, you have to have started with on a visa. So here with documentation, where you're living in the U.S. temporarily, but your permanent residence is outside the U.S. These are typically family visas, student visas, work-related visas. There's other ones, though: refugee, asylum, humanitarian, and special programs. And some of those do involve undocumented immigrants, so people who came without a visa. And so some work visas, like for example, are around 3 years, but if you're a temporary agricultural worker, it's just a max of 12 months. Student visas are usually for the length of the program. For a family visa, if you're a spouse, you can have 2 years. If you're a fiance, you can have 90 days. And so then once you are here with a visa, then you can apply for a green card to be a permanent resident. And that time frame really varies depending upon what your visa was and your situation. But typically you have to be sponsored by someone. You can't just do it on your own. So you have to be sponsored by a family member or an employer. Then once you've had a green card for at least 5 years, you can apply to be a citizen. You have to have had continuous residence in the United States. You can see their good moral character. You'll say that you adhere to the U.S. Constitution, no criminal record, read, writing, and speaking English, passing the test on U.S. history and government, and taking the oath of allegiance. This can be expedited. Citizenship can be expedited if you've served in the U.S. military, but you have to have had a visa or a green card for the length of your enlistment. A research article by Gonzalez details the process of undocumented kids becoming undocumented adults. This is basically a painful move from almost a de facto legal status, even though it's not really legal, but it feels more legal, to a de facto illegal status. Undocumented kids are basically more protected, but undocumented adults less so. So as of 1982, we had a legal, undocumented immigrant children have a legal right to K through 12 education. And so they are often assimilated with their peers in a somewhat protected environment in the school. The FERPA Act of 1974 prevents schools from releasing documentation status, but there may be circumstances in which federal immigration laws require districts to provide immigration about a student to another federal, state, or local government entity. But once kids turn 18, now they are undocumented adults. They cannot legally work or vote. They may or may not be able to obtain a driver's license. Colorado is one of about 19 states that allow it. In terms of applying to college, there's no federal or state laws prohibiting admission, but institutions can vary, and some institutions do require student applications to provide evidence of legal status. But even though you may be able to be admitted as an undocumented immigrant student, you aren't eligible for any federal aid. And so the basic point is that kind of the normative transitions that American citizens might go through moving from childhood to adulthood are disrupted if you're an undocumented immigrant. Okay, so here's a couple of policies related to undocumented immigrant emerging adults, and we hear about these, and you may know more, so feel free to tell me or correct me. So these are both policies are for people brought to the U.S. as minors without citizenship. And so the DREAM Act, as you can see, has been proposed over 20 times at the federal level, but it's never been passed. Each version probably might have some differences, but typically it's things like coming to the U.S. before you've turned 16, been here at least 5 years, no criminal record, have earned a high school diploma, and then you could become a conditional resident for 6 years and then a permanent resident if you complete 2 years of college or 2 years in the military. But again, this has never passed. So states have passed kind of little versions of this. So in Colorado, we passed the Asset Bill in 2013, which provides in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants in Colorado who have attended a Colorado high school for 3 years and graduated and have declared their intention to pursue legal immigration status. DACA, which we hear a lot about, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, started under the Obama administration in 2012, again, allows some individuals brought to the country as children to receive a 2-year period of deferred action from deportation. So this isn't about citizenship. This just basically says we won't deport you, and you can have maybe a work permit, or you can attend the university or school. You can't have felonies or serious misdemeanors. Basically, you have to apply for renewal every 2 years. How this is treated depends upon often the administration. So there was a multi-year period under the previous Trump administration where applications were not accepted. Then they were accepted again under the Biden administration. Now renewal, applications are still being accepted, but as of 2025, initial requests are accepted, but they're not being processed, as I understand it. Okay, so this film is a little bit older now, but I really think it's important for helping this undocumented immigration issue come alive for us. So it's a 19-minute original film plus a 6-minute film update. And just some background on it. In 1992, Sam and Alida Mieja left Guatemala during a violent civil war and brought their 1-year-old son, Gilbert, to California. They settled in Marin County and then lived there for 17 years, working, paying taxes, and actually saving enough money to buy a home. They had 2 more kids, Helen and Dolce, who under laws of the time I'm speaking are currently U.S. citizens. Their house was raided accidentally. It was a case of mistaken identity. They thought it was somebody else. They were raided in 2007, and once they found them, they began the deportation processes. In 2009, they were deported. Under the law at this time, as punishment, deportees face a ban of 3 to 10 years that they have to stay in their home country before they can even apply for legal reentry with a visa. The process, of course, is challenging. In the film update, you'll see that the parents get humanitarian visas to be able to return to the U.S., but they have to reapply every year. Gilbert, as you'll see, doesn't have a path to citizenship, but he's not being deported. Helen would have to be 21 to be able to sponsor her parents to be citizens. So as you watch, I'm hoping you're going to be thinking about what you've learned in this class or other HDFS classes. I want you to put yourself in the mind of, like, here you are, an HDFS expert. What do you want policymakers to know about family theories that might help us understand this, our knowledge of individual development, whether that's childhood, adolescent, or adulthood. And then, so what do we want people to know about the micro level as they're making macro level policies? Okay, let's move into work and family policies, which I was studied in the work and family field for about 10 years. And so this is an area near and dear to my heart. And this is where I really started to understand the power of policy. So I was at the same time training to be a couples therapist, and I was often maybe helping couples try to work through, work-life balance, work-family issues, challenges. And I began to realize that there was only so much I could do as a therapist, with helping them either come up with individual strategies or couple level strategies, for equally shared parenting or things like that, without bumping up against policies. They were so limited, for example, in parental leave or in kind of workplace restrictions. And so this is where I really began to understand the power of policy in people's individual lives. Workplace policies are where we can really see, again, that there's not a lot of federal laws and regulations, and that more power is given to states or workplaces. And so, as we'll see when we watch the Motherhood Manifesto film, the U.S. has few work-family policies as compared to other developed countries, right? We don't have mandatory paid vacation days. We don't have, or holidays for everybody. We don't have, we have federal holidays, but you only get them off if you're a federal employee. You're not guaranteed them off just, as a general worker. We don't have any federal parental leave requirements or any universal child care like many other developed countries do, or universal health insurance, for example. So An example would be of a federal policy would be the Family and Medical Leave Act, which allows you to keep your job and have about 12 weeks of unpaid leave, and it only applies to some workplaces. But obviously, unpaid leave is pretty challenging if you're in a stressful caregiving or medical health situation. So then states have kind of made up some of their own rules, passed their own laws, and these really vary by state. So, for example, Colorado has a family and medical leave insurance program that's paid. 13 other states have some sort of mandatory program like this. And this means that most Colorado workers are eligible for these paid benefits, including people who are self-employed or independent contractors, or anybody else whose company has opted out of covering them, at least for some portion of it. Yeah. Let's see. And so these can be used for things like leave for yourself, to care for family members, safe leave in the cases of domestic violence, or leave related to being in a military family. And then we have workplace policies related to the work and family. And these obviously radically vary by employer, with some very progressive and some more traditional. So for example, these are often leave policies around sick leave, paid leave, parental leave, or they could be, as we're going to see, policies for, associated with, working from home or hours or those kinds of things. So at CSU, we have, for example, a leave sharing program that creates a leave bank. This is for state classified employees, not for admin, pros, or faculty, but where state classified employees can contribute their unused leave that others can draw on during a time of need. CSU used to, when I first started here many years ago, had no formal parental leave policy. So if somebody got pregnant, they could use some of their sick time, I think, and that was it for having a baby. There was no leave. But as of 2025, CSU employees now have 18 weeks of parental leave. But it was a long time before that really got figured out and to be something reasonable. Okay, so in the Joan Williams reading, you're going to hear her kind of lay out some of the work-family challenges that we're seeing, and I'll kind of extend to those here, and we'll see some of this in the Motherhood Manifesto as well. So we are struggling with basically lack of affordable, high-quality childcare, right? We don't have any universal preschool at the federal level. We do have some state subsidies for childcare, so this is, again, will vary by state. We're struggling, of course, with healthcare. We have the Affordable Care Act trying to address some of that, how to help all families have affordable, high-quality insurance and healthcare. We have seen some changes in workplace schedules. We're going to get into workplace flexibility on the upcoming slides, but COVID kind of changed some of our some workplace flexibility for some people. Like I mentioned already, we're struggling with kind of, we don't have any uniform requirements for kind of paid time off at the federal level for vacation, parental leave, or sick leave. So again, that is state or workplace specific. There's lots of research about the challenges of non-standard work hours. So we live in a 24/7 environment. The United States, we like to have everything open. If you go to other European countries, for example, you realize that they don't care if the hours said they were going to be open and they're not, or they're closed in the middle of the day. And so what we know is that non-standard work hours, working nights, working weekends to kind of support our 27 services, create challenges for individuals, sleep disruption, and what that does to you, challenges for couples who now become like ships passing in the night, who don't have that time together. There are some benefits for kids, actually, who might be having more parental care rather than kind of out-of-home care, and they maybe are getting more direct care from fathers than they would have otherwise, but lots of challenges for families there. And then, of course, we are a nation of longer work hours. We're not the longest, but we do work a lot. So the recommendations generally follow the challenges that we need, high quality, affordable, and accessible childcare and healthcare, that we need family-friendly work policies, that you have the option to work part-time and you earn proportional pay. And so what that means is, for example, here at CSU, if you are a full-time faculty member, you might have just this one salary, and you might, for example, it depends, what you're going to teach. Maybe for someone like me, I teach 4 classes a semester, a 4-4 load. If someone is hired adjunct, and they're teaching, for example, a 2-2 load, they're not getting half of what I make. They're getting a lot less, right? So it's not proportional pay for part-time work. And you have to be doing at least 50%, at least for at CSU, to have benefits. Some places you can't even have benefits if you're part-time. And of course, we have a perception that if you're part-time, you won't be able to advance into like a managerial or supervisory role. So we need to and this is all, workplace level generally, not state or federal level, that we need to be providing this. We'll talk more about workplace flexibility on the next slide. Maybe this idea of job sharing, which has never really taken off, but I know, for example, when my kids were in elementary school, there was a first grade classroom that was job shared between 2 teachers. And the idea is it's different from part-time because 2 people are basically trying to make one position seamless, and so they're going to communicate well with each other so that each teacher knows what's happening, on the days that they're not there, for example. And then, of course, having paid leave to care for yourself or ill or family members. And we are seeing, more states are enacting, but maybe only about a third of them have these laws around paid leave. And then, of course, equal pay and equal opportunities for women. Workers, especially parents, often value flexibility even more than higher pay. And as Williams has noted, these flexibility options are usually available to higher income workers. And so that creates challenges for lower income families who may not have these options. Okay, so flexibility in when you do your work, the time of the day, do you get to choose, maybe you have to work 8 hours, but you can decide how early you're going to start, or how late you're going to work, or if you're going to take a break in the middle. Or do you have flexibility in the amount of hours, meaning, for example, you can work to tasks, not to time. Like as a university professor, no one's tracking my hours. I just have to get my work done. Do you have the choice, if you don't have these other flexibility in terms of time of day or amount of hours, do you have a choice of a consistent work shift? Like I get to choose that I'm always going to do 6 to 3 or 7 to 4. Or if you can't have that option, do you have the choice of an inconsistent work shift? Or maybe that's even better for you, where you sign up for shifts on a weekly or monthly basis. Do you have the option for a compressed work week, like 4 10-hour days, and you take Fridays off? Are you able to leave work for things for your kids or, other things that you might have going on personally? And if you're on a kind of time clock where you get a 15-minute break, do you at least get to decide when that break is? And then, of course, where can you work from home? Can you telecommute or can you work from home? Can you telecommute? And obviously COVID dramatically changed all of that for a lot of us. And then how much are you working? Can you switch? Like if you had a child, could you drop to part-time? And then, when they got a little bit older, could you bump back up to full-time? Okay, this film is older, and I wish it was called the Parenthood Manifesto, not the Motherhood Manifesto, but I still think it has a lot of great information in it. And I'll try to guide you to what I think is the most important parts to watch. And so if you were to have to lobby for one of these policies, which one would be your priority? Paid parental leave, flexible or part-time work and benefits, paid sick time for yourself or family, healthcare, or universal preschool? All right, let's talk for just briefly about step-parent policy. Okay, so as you read in the Mason chapter, we are pretty much governed by a stranger model across most states rather than a dependency model. And what that means is that the law treats step-parents essentially as strangers related to children in particular. So step-parents can't consent for field trips or medical care. They have fewer rights than a legal guardian or a foster parent. They don't have to, children can't inherit from them unless it's specified. They don't have to pay child support following a divorce, but they also can't get custody or visitation following a divorce. They're essentially kind of strangers without any legal ties. The only evidence, the only way that we have actually a dependency model is with TANF or welfare benefits, where we take into account the step-parent's earnings to determine your eligibility. But step-parent's earnings, for example, don't play into child support payments. And so Mason suggests some policy changes, and you could be thinking about kind of the pros and cons of what we have now versus what Mason is suggesting. So gains, sacrifices, and consequences. She says basically if we were to create change, you could be a voluntarist or a reformist. And so voluntarist would say that step-parents could volunteer to be a de facto third parent with legal responsibility. Currently in the US, you can only have 2 legal parents, but for example, England does allow for 3 legal parents. So maybe we could create this option and allow people to select into it. Then she also has a reformist model where you are considered automatically a de facto parent if you meet certain numbers, a certain amount of criteria. So for example, if you were kind of someone who was, if you were legally married to the natural parent who had physical custody and you were providing at least 50% of the child support, then you would actually have some de facto rights and responsibilities. You could, for example, maybe consent to medical treatment or sign field trip forms. This wouldn't be adoption. And then following death or divorce, de facto step-parents would have to pay some child support for up to half the years of dependency until the child reached 18. So for example, if they'd been a de facto parent for 4 years, then they would need to pay child support for 2 years following divorce. And under these recommendations, they could also pursue visitation or custody, and they could stepchildren could inherit money if the step-parent died without a will. So again, these are just recommendations. Nothing has been taken, no action has been taken on this, but you could be thinking kind of what you prefer for this. So since in the United States we only allow 2 legal parents, a step-parent can only adopt if there's only 1 legal parent. And this is the law in Colorado, and of course it varies by state. But here are our criteria. First, that the biological parent consents, that the child consents if they're over the age of 12, that the step-parent has been married to the biological parent for at least a year, and then the other biological parent has to either be deceased or have had their parental rights terminated for things like having abandoned the child for more than a year. And so that means, even if maybe they paid 1 child support payment or they talked to them a couple of times on the phone, if they really weren't kind of following through, they could still meet the criteria for abandonment or reasonable support. This is about one of the few ways that we easily allow a step-parent's rights a biological parent's rights to be terminated. Generally, we are only going to do that in the case of maltreatment. Most of the time, we wouldn't normally, just if a parent isn't communicative or paying child support, we wouldn't terminate their rights because we always think it's better for kids to have as many legal parents as possible. But we will terminate their rights if we have another parent lined up to perhaps kind of do a better job providing for or supervising or caring for this kid. And this can be about a six-month process. Okay, we're on to our last area, father involvement, and just a couple of policies here. So regarding kind of resident fathers, there are policies that can encourage essentially father involvement, and Sweden has one of those. So paid parental leave in Sweden is 16 months, which is crazy sounding for us, or 480 days for each child. If there's 2 parents, then they get 240 days each is the default, but they can transfer up to 150 days to the other parent. However, 90 days, 3 months, is reserved for each parent in a 2-parent family, and it's a use it or lose it. So what this means is that a new father is incentivized to take his 3 months to be with his new baby, because otherwise he can't give it to, for example, his wife if he's in a heterosexual relationship. Okay, so this is United States policy related to father involvement, specifically for unmarried, non-residential fathers. And I hope you'll be thinking about kind of the pros, cons, or gains, sacrifices, intended, unintended consequences, and what you think about this law. So whereas, so first, to just be clear, the decision to end a pregnancy is the pregnant female's. However, once the baby is born, then mothers who give birth are the biological and legal parents automatically, unless, of course, they're going through an adoption process. Every child has a biological father, but if the parents are not married, then the child, as default, does not have a legal father. And the biological father does not have any legal rights or responsibilities to the child until paternity is established. Now, this can be as easy as both parents, signing the voluntary acknowledgement of paternity form, either in the hospital or up until the child turns 18. Interestingly, if a mother is married at the time of birth or less than 300, or has been married at least 300 days prior to the birth, then that person who she's married to is considered the legal father or perhaps legal parent without having to sign anything, even though he might not actually be the legal father. Okay, so then once, basically, once a father establishes paternity, then his legal rights equal the mother's. He can have his name on the birth certificate. He has the right to court-ordered custody and visitation. He has the right to have a say and be informed in adoption proceedings. And he has some precedence. If the mother just wants to place the child up for adoption, the father and his family have priority in the adoption process. Now, the challenge, of course, is what about men who don't even know that they've fathered a child or aren't sure? How much, for example, do states try to get in touch, figure out who the biological father is in adoption proceedings, and get in touch with them in order to give them the option, or them and their family the option to adopt? So about half of states have what they call putative father registries, where men who believe they've conceived a child outside of marriage and wish to be notified about adoption proceedings can put their names on these lists. These are not well publicized, and they don't really translate across state lines. So that's kind of our current status. And again, once a father has parental rights, they're not easily terminated. Termination or relinquishment of parental rights, it's not taken lightly by the courts unless there's a plan for another person, like the mother's spouse, to adopt the child, because this is considered to create an undue burden on the custodial parent and not be in the best interest of the child. Okay, phew, you have made it to the end of the very last lecture of this class. I can't thank you enough for, listening into it. I know it's tough to listen to online lectures. That is the primary way that I'm teaching you stuff in this class. So thank you for hanging in there. And I'd ask you to just reflect, what's something from this course that you've already used or are likely to use in your personal and professional life? What are you taking from the class? And since I'm not asking for that in a class participation assignment, I'm totally open to you emailing me and letting me know your thoughts.